up and sit down.
Welcome back, you filthy beasts, to another episode of Janessa After Dark. I'm your host, Miss Janessa J. Champagne, or Miss J if you're nasty, and we really, really hope you're nasty. I am so excited for this episode for a number of reasons. Season 2, Episode 3 has a few milestones associated with it. Not only is it our 13th episode, and it's coming out on Halloween, which is perfect, but it's part of the content that we're releasing for the grand opening relaunch of the World of Champagne at JANESSA.com. So recently there were some problems with my website, and the old databases got scrubbed, and I lost almost 6 years of content. That hurt a little bit. That was like a stab in the heart if I still had one. Now, there was some content I was able to salvage using a little thing on the web called the Wayback Machine, and I definitely breathed a sigh of relief when I was able to retrieve most of my blogs, but I did lose pretty much all of the makeup forum content, all of my local arts and theater content, and a few other things here and there. Now, obviously, at that point, I had a choice. I could decide to shut down the site and just say, you know what, it was fun, it was a great 6 years, or I could rebuild from the ground up. And because I'm a glutton for punishment, I decided it was time for the World of Champagne 2.0. So I got some new website templates. I got together with my favorite photographer, Miranda Rowan, to get some brand spanking new images, and I rolled up my sequin sleeves and got to work. And I have to say, for all of the frustration, for all the blood, sweat, and tears, I am so excited for the new website. It's definitely got a slicker, more modern design. I actually have educated myself on how to do some of the editing so that I can move things around and I can make changes and I can really personalize it. You know, I'm really appreciative of Jean and Natalie, the people who run the server that my website is on and who host my website. They've both been really great about helping to make changes on my website, but it's really wonderful and empowering to be able to make those changes myself, be able to go right into the interface and play around, move pictures around, change a background, change content areas, add a content area, get rid of a content area, add in a form, things like that. And it's definitely a learning curve. For somebody with as many technological challenges as I have, I don't know why I thought it was a great idea to, run a website for 6 years, start a podcast, and maybe dip my toes into YouTube. I don't know why that seemed like a good idea, but again, I'm glutton for punishment, and I'm so happy that I am because I just absolutely love the World of Champagne at Janessa J. We've got the brand new website, and I thought, you know what? Halloween is right around the corner. It's my favorite holiday. It's my favorite day of the entire year. Why not have a big grand reopening with a ton of content and really just have a great time? So I got the images back from Miranda just in time to put together a gallery. I have a brand new review on the Lime Crime Birthday collection in the makeup forum. And actually, with the new website, the makeup forum is now called the lifestyle section. And one of the improvements that I'm working on making for the website is we're actually going to launch a companion website called lifestylebyjanessa.com. That new website is going to have all of the same fabulous makeup content that we had in the makeup forum on the old site. It's also going to host a lot more tutorials and how-tos. I want to embed and share a lot more video resources, things like that, for people who may be looking for instructional materials on how to do makeup. And I'm also going to have links to my Fit for a Queen jewelry designs. I'm super excited to be able to branch out and have this second website. And that way, the people who aren't as interested in the makeup content can go to janessaj.com, and it'll be a much more streamlined experience, much less makeup content on the page. There will still be some. The lifestyle section will be on janessaj.com as well. Some of the content will get posted there and a link over to Lifestyle by Janessa. But generally, the interface will be a little bit more streamlined for the blogs and for show announcements, for things that I'm up to with Champagne Dreams Productions. And the Lifestyle by Janessa.com is going to be where we have the jewelry and the makeup and the fashion and all that really fun glamour stuff. So I'm super excited to be sharing that with you. And I'm super excited that this is going to be our grand reopening episode of Janessa After Dark. Since we're having the big relaunch, I wanted to make sure I had a really fantastic guest for this episode. And for our big relaunch, our 13th episode being released on Halloween, what could be better than an iconic scream queen from my all-time favorite horror movie? For more than 2 decades, I have been obsessed with the movie Sleepaway Camp. Although it's often dismissed as just another summer camp slasher, it actually has a really complex portrayal of both sexuality and gender. It's a film that I've really wrestled with since my first viewing. It actually inspired a large chunk of my master's thesis. And as I've continued to think about it and take it apart and analyze it over the years, I've come to feel that it actually has a really progressive message about gender and sexuality, something that was definitely ahead of its time for the early 1980s. And the sad thing is that this film often gets dismissed as being transphobic, when in fact, I think that it actually has a much more subversive and much more liberating message for queer folks, although it's somewhat complicated by being immersed in the gender and sexuality politics of its time. And at the center of this crazy, wild, mixed up story is Angela Baker, played by Felissa Rose. We'll get to Felissa's interview soon, but first, I want to spend a little bit of time digging into Sleepaway Camp and its portrayals of sexuality and gender. Before we dive into Sleepaway Camp specifically, I do want to talk a little bit about the issue of transphobia in horror film. Not only am I a lover of the horror genre, but I'm also a lover of queer theory. And I think that when you get really into queer theory, it can be easy to forget that there are real people who have real lives and experiences behind some of the cultural products and things that you talk about. So while I may be arguing that certain films are not transphobic or that they may not contain the messages that people think that they contain, one of the foundational principles of sociology is the Thomas Principle. And the basic idea behind the Thomas Principle is that if something is real for someone's experience, if that's how they experience it, then functionally it's real in our society. A great example of that is race. Biologically, scientifically speaking, race, the way we talk about it and look at it in our culture, is meaningless. Human beings are much more genetically similar to one another across any sort of identity lines than they are different. In our genetics, in our chromosomes, even in terms of variation on facial features, all of these different markers that we often attribute to racial identity. Scientifically, they're meaningless, but one doesn't have to look at our culture for more than a few seconds to realize that race is absolutely fundamentally important to how we interact with each other, with how power relationships are constructed, and that the idea of race, the construction of race, has real and sometimes very detrimental effects on people's lives. Because it's real for their perception, it's real. That's what the Thomas Principle says. And so while I may be arguing for a certain interpretation of a cultural product, I never want to forget that there are real trans people who feel that they've been hurt by these films and who feel like their identities are questioned or mocked or in some ways diminished by these portrayals. And that's part of why I like queer theory. That's part of why I like to dig into these cultural products. I have always been a fan of reading against the grain, of trying to find a different interpretation, a different way of seeing cultural products. I'm very much a fan of Michel Foucault, and Foucault's idea of power is that it's not in that obvious place that you look. Power is where people are exerting it, and there are lots of different types of power. Power is very complicated, and by taking a look at products that we once thought had a specific interpretation and trying to find the actual exercise of power and try to figure out what the representations mean, we can actually open up new avenues for understanding, for critiquing, and for giving power to people who were previously marginalized. So if there are any trans people who listen to this podcast who feel personally hurt by this movie, I just want you to know that my fandom, my interest in examining and critiquing this in no way diminishes how you feel about this cultural product. And once you listen to my argument, and I hope you will, I certainly hope that you will consider the argument that I put forth, but I want you to know that I still respect how you feel about these movies and about these portrayals. So with that said, let's talk about the 3 films that are most often accused of being transphobic in the horror genre. There are lots of examples. Horror is filled with examples of gender being twisted and turned. Even if it's not a direct cross-gender portrayal, there are a lot of instances of feminized men or masculinized women in horror, and especially in the slasher subgenre of horror. That's a tongue twister. But the big 3 that I hear talked about the most are Psycho, Silence of the Lambs, and Sleepaway Camp. Now let's set aside Silence of the Lambs for a moment, because that actually does deal with the idea of transsexuality, and it does explicitly attempt to portray someone who is identified as trans, and does so in a way that many people feel is problematic. So I want to talk about that separately, but first I want to talk about Psycho and Sleepaway Camp. Now I'm going to talk in some depth about all three of these movies, so I guess this serves as your spoiler alert. Though if you need a spoiler alert for a movie that came out in 1960, I really have to question how you've been planning your time. You've had time to see Psycho. It's been out for 58 years. Get it together. Now, the main reason why I think we can argue against transphobia in both Psycho and Sleepaway Camp is that these characters are not trans characters. Norman Bates is never presented as wanting to transition or feeling that he is a woman because he has adopted the persona of his mother. He is presented as a psychopath who, because of the guilt over killing his mother, has now adopted her abusive, controlling persona. It's almost presented as an early version of multiple personality disorder, which is now commonly referred to as dissociative identity disorder. When Marion Crane meets quiet, unassuming Norman Bates, there is nothing in his demeanor to suggest the presence of the murderous mother. In fact, Norman quite genuinely seems unaware that he is mother, that he is the shrill, judgmental voice criticizing him and taunting him as he attempts to befriend Marion Crane. The fact that he dresses up as mother is just an extension of his taking on the persona. When he dissociates from his Norman identity and becomes a mother, he also changes his physical appearance to look like mother. This is common for people with dissociative identity disorder who often report that their different alters or personalities have different ways of speaking, different ways of carrying themselves, and even build different wardrobes. The fact that Norman dresses like mother, it's just as much a piece of the psychosis as it is a screen gag to help cover up the reveal that's waiting for Vera Miles in the basement when she finds Mrs. Bates' mummified corpse and Norman enters the room in full mother costume wielding a knife. The same is true for Angela Baker, or perhaps more appropriately, Peter Baker. In Sleepaway Camp, the film starts with two children, Peter and Angela, who are playing on a boat with their father. There's an accident, and the visuals after the accident establish that the father has died, as has one of the children, we assume. We see one of the children from behind, unidentifiable, splashing in the water, and then we see the father float by face down, and a bloody life preserver rises to the surface. The film then flashes forward to 8 years later, and we see Angela about to leave for camp with her cousin Ricky. Because of this, we assume that Angela is the child that survived the boating accident. Now, as the film progresses and people start to die, most of the suspicion is shifted onto Ricky. However, in a flashback sequence, we see a child with a bandaged head standing in front of Aunt Martha, Ricky's mother, who is now Angela's caretaker. Aunt Martha is talking about how she's bought all these pretty new clothes, lots of new dresses, and she knows that the child will just love it there. But what she reveals is that the child who survived the accident isn't Angela, it's actually Peter. And Aunt Martha forces Peter to take on the persona of Angela because for whatever twisted reason, she doesn't want two boys in the house. She wants a boy and a girl. Now, why that might be, I'm going to get to a little later. But it's Aunt Martha who forces Peter to take on the persona of Angela. Angela, played by Felissa Rose, never expresses a desire to transition, never expresses that being a girl is somehow their real and true identity. In both of these cases, neither of these characters is trans. And in the case of Sleepaway Camp, I would argue it's actually the fact that Peter is not trans and is forced into the persona of Angela that causes him to go on a murderous rampage. Now, the question that follows is, does this matter? Does whether or not a character is actually identified or portrayed as trans matter to whether or not a film is transphobic? A friend of mine, Emma Alice Johnson, wrote a guest post for HorrorSociety.com called "It's Time to Talk About Transphobia in Horror." And she argues that it doesn't matter. And I'd like to quote part of what she wrote because it really did make me think about how I interpret and view and react to these films. She writes, "A common argument is that the characters in these films are not presented as being trans, nor do they meet most definitions of transgender. Norman Bates in Psycho is not dressing as a woman because he believes himself to be one, nor is Angela Baker in Sleepaway Camp. In Norman's case, he does so because he has suffered a psychological break and believes himself to be his mother. mother. In Angela's case, she has been forced to do so by her aunt to fill the role of Angela's dead sister. A little further down, she continues, so in these and other films that use this trope, one might argue that the villain is not a transgender person. Even under the more expansive definition of transgender, it is difficult to shoehorn these characters in. However, that these villains are not actually presented as being trans is irrelevant, because they are still perceived to be trans or equated with being trans by a viewership that has little or no other exposure to transgender people. Here's a question. Can you confidently explain the distinction between a crossdresser and a transgender person? Between a drag queen and a crossdresser? Between a drag queen and a trans person? Did you know that these are all different? The general public does not. This is not a judgment call, just reality. End of quote. I really had to think about and grapple with what Emma was writing about in that passage, but in the end, I have to disagree with her. I don't feel that you can make a judgment that a work itself is inherently transphobic because the perceived audience won't understand the distinction between the characters presented and the real lived experiences of trans people. That to me is not a transphobic piece of work. It's somebody who takes a piece of art that they're interacting with and misuses the characters and the images presented to support their own transphobia. So while there are certainly transphobic results, and while she makes a very salient point about many people in our culture not understanding the distinctions between lots of different kinds of gender variant people, I don't think that we can go so far as to say that works of art themselves are transphobic just because the way people use them or interpret them in some circumstances is transphobic, especially if we're talking about modern audiences. Now, certainly the audiences for Psycho in 1960 would have had very little context or understanding of transgender people. Christine Jorgensen's groundbreaking memoir would have come out in 1952. There were some other high-profile stories of an emerging transgender community, but in 1960 there wasn't a great understanding of trans identity or trans experience. There would have been somewhat more information about trans lives and experiences in 1983 when Sleepaway Camp was released, and the existence of transgender people was at least enough a part of the cultural zeitgeist in 1991 when Silence of the Lambs was released for a key part of the storyline to revolve around the medical processes and procedures surrounding transition. For viewers in 2018, where they live in a world where TLC is presenting the groundbreaking show about transgender teen Jazz, and even vapid fame whores like the Kardashians are talking about transgender identity, thanks to the very public transition and sometimes problematic persona of Caitlyn Jenner, it's much harder to assume that audiences do not have some basic understanding of transgender lives and experiences, and at least some ability to differentiate trans people from other types of gender variant people. Now, obviously, there are still going to be people who choose not to make that distinction. There are going to be people who choose to equate being a trans person with being a crossdresser or a drag queen. But again, I don't think that the transphobic choices and actions of potential audience members dictates whether or not the work that they are viewing is inherently transphobic. It's a little bit tougher to make a case for Silence of the Lambs. I want to go back to Emma's post where she writes, "It's not so easy to write off Jamie Buffalo Bill Gum in Silence of the Lambs as not being trans. In the film, and even more so in the book, it is explained that doctors have deemed him not transgender despite him believing himself to be. This begs the question, what gives doctors the right to decide whether someone is transgender? To this day, the medical establishment forces trans people to jump through hoops to prove that they are the gender they know themselves to be. Treatment, the foundation of which is hormone replacement therapy that is no more dangerous than the antidepressants that are thrown around willy-nilly, may be withheld for months or even years until the patient does this to the doctor's satisfaction. Buffalo Bill may very well be trans and the victim of a prejudicial medical establishment." End quote. And while the film is by no means a perfect portrayal, and the visual presentation of Buffalo Bill is troublingly exploitative, there is something in what Emma writes that leaves room for us to read against the grain and to see Buffalo Bill as just as much a victim as they are a perpetrator. After all, if you really look at how the narrative is presented, Buffalo Bill is not a murderer because they are transgender. Buffalo Bill is a murderer because they are transgender and have been denied access to what our culture has defined as the tools of transition. And so they have to take matters into their own hands, and those drastic measures are what is presented in the film as horror. And so while Buffalo Bill is certainly a perpetrator, they're also a victim. And to make that distinction and to call out that medical establishment that turned Buffalo Bill into the monster of this film, I think is a very powerful statement. And that brings us back around to Sleepaway Camp. I think there is a way to read the film as actually very progressive for its time in terms of how it thinks about sexuality. But in order to get there, you have to employ some of the understandings about sexuality and gender that were common in the 1980s that aren't really part of our common understanding today. And the biggest one is that in that time, there wasn't as much of a clear distinction between sexual orientation and gender identity. People didn't understand as much nuance between those two communities of people. People who had maybe a non-normative sexual identity or sexual orientation, and people who had a non-normative gender identity or gender presentation. And so although the focus of the film is on the crossing of gender boundaries, Peter being forced to take on the persona of Angela, the commentary in the film is actually about sexuality. And the pieces that connect the two are a frame story about Peter and Angela's father and Angela's budding relationship with fellow camper Paul. I already mentioned that at the beginning of Sleepaway Camp, Peter and Angela are playing on a boat with their father. In that same scene, there's a man on the shore who yells to them and reminds them that they have to hurry or they're going to be late to meet Martha. He is also there to witness the accident. There's no explanation given at the time about who that man is. Later on in the film, when we start to get more of Angela and we start to get a sense that maybe Ricky isn't the perpetrator, that maybe all of this flash and sizzle about Ricky's temper is a distraction. As things really start to maybe shift in that direction, we see a flashback. And in the flashback, Peter and Angela's father and the man from the shore in the opening scene are in bed together. They're embracing each other very lovingly. The scene is extremely tender and is frankly out of place in this horror film. If it wasn't happening in the context of teenagers getting murdered at summer camp, it would actually be a very beautiful and very loving scene. There's clearly a lot of emotion and a lot of intimacy between these two men. Peter and Angela are watching in the doorway and giggling. Suddenly the scene shifts, and now we see Peter and Angela sitting across from each other on a bed, and the camera spins around the bed as Peter is slowly reaching out his finger to touch Angela. This flashback is happening after Paul has walked Angela back to her cabin, and he's leaning in and attempting to kiss her. Now in the flashback, just as Peter's finger is about to touch Angela, we snap back to the present, and Angela shouts no and runs away from Paul. Before this, she seemed to really like Paul. He's one of the few people at camp that she has actually opened up to, and the affection that Angela feels for him seems to be real. Not long after that, Angela invites Paul down to the waterfront and invites him to go skinny dipping. Obviously, this would entail taking off her clothes and revealing the truth about her secret, that she is actually Peter. After they start to undress, and once the counselors have started to find the bodies and they figured out that something is wrong, they're trying to round up all the campers, they realize that Angela is still missing. Two of the counselors, Ronnie and Susie, who happen to be two of the only people at camp who have been friendly to Angela, find her sitting naked at the edge of the water. Paul is reclining with his head in her lap. They call out to her. And this is where we get the flashback with Aunt Martha, where we discover that Angela is actually Peter, that Angela is the child who died in the boating accident. Once we know that, we see Peter stand up and reveal not only his body, including full frontal nudity, but also reveals that he has murdered Paul by decapitation. It's a very grisly ending thing, and the scene is extremely well done and very disturbing, from the visuals to the sound design. And after the reveal, there is none of the traditional denouement. There is no explanation of what happened. There is no righting the wrong. There is no sense that things have been returned back to normal. We simply see Angela, who we now understand to be Peter, standing there naked, covered in blood, making this very primal sound, and then the screen burns out on that image and then fades to black. So with that reveal, with the shock and awe factor of it, how can we take that and read it as anything other than transphobia? And again, it goes back to that conflation of gender with sexuality. Now, another idea from the 1980s that's really been debunked is that as gay and lesbian people were becoming more a part of society, there was a lot of question about whether or not gay and lesbian couples could raise children. And there was a lot of erroneous information that led people to believe that gay couples would raise gay children, that somehow being raised in a household with two men or two women would lead the child to also be gay. Now, if we accept that piece of cultural knowledge from the time as being part of the worldview of sleepaway camp and combine that with the fact that gender and sexuality are often conflated during this time, we can completely understand what Aunt Martha does in a new and different and very unsettling way. Aunt Martha now becomes the enforcer of heteronormativity. She forces Peter to become Angela so that there's a gender balance, there's a male and a female, because she's trying to counteract the fact that Peter was raised in a household with two men. She says, we can't have two boys in the house, that would never do. And what she means is that by allowing two boys in the house, it would mirror the situation that Peter and Angela grew up in. It would give Peter validation in the sexual orientation of the people who raised him, as well as in his own emerging sexual orientation. She's trying to, in a way, undo the damage she thinks has been done by Peter being raised by a gay couple. And so in the same way that the doctors who refused Buffalo Bill the tools of transition, Aunt Martha becomes implicated in the murders that happen at Camp Arawak. If she had not imposed a gender transition on Peter in order to counter what she felt were the harmful effects of being raised by a gay couple, then Peter would not have gone on his murderous rampage. In fact, I think the fact that Angela and Paul having actual chemistry and actual affection for each other speaks to the fact that Peter, if he had been left to his own development, would have grown up to be gay. It's almost like the film is embracing that stereotype that gay couples will raise children and say, well, so what? If only Peter had been left alone to discover that identity, he could have met Paul and potentially fallen in love. It could have been a love story. Or if nothing else, it could have been a story of an awkward gay boy at camp falling in love with his straight best friend. In fact, I think you could almost read the death of the father in the beginning as another common trope that happens in films where gays have to be punished. They have to die. But it inverts that trope by later showing how loving and affectionate they actually were. In this case, gays aren't presented as a monster that needs to be destroyed, but rather the innocent victims of circumstance, and a culture that refuses to recognize and validate their existence. Regardless, it's the fact that Peter is put into an identity that doesn't belong to him just to serve that push towards heteronormativity, towards what society deems acceptable, that causes the problems at camp. And so in this way, Angela or Peter is not only a perpetrator, but also a victim. And Aunt Martha becomes the true villain of the piece. Peter, in his new persona as Angela, is merely the instrument. I'm not saying that the film is perfect or that there's nothing about it that might be problematic. And going back to what I said at the beginning of this piece, none of this argument negates how actual trans people feel when viewing this film. I think that this film is especially difficult for modern audiences to grapple with because we have a much better understanding of the distinction between gender and sexuality. And this film really does conflate them in some sort of problematic ways. I felt it myself as I was talking about the main character. Because I'm arguing that Peter is not actually trans and never intended to transition, never wanted to transition, I feel like I should honor that by always referring to him with male pronouns and by referring to him as Peter. But in the film, we don't get to know Peter. We get to know Angela. And that character that Felissa Rose creates is such a real character and so wonderfully embodies that fragile vulnerability of a young girl on the edge of puberty being mercilessly bullied that it's hard for me not to think of that character as Angela. It's hard for me not to do the same damage that Aunt Martha has done and ascribe that identity to that character's body. And because of that, I become complicit in what Aunt Martha has done to Peter. And that's why I find Sleepaway Camp so fascinating, because it doesn't give us any answers. It doesn't wrap it up nicely. We're left looking at this character that we've come to know through the course of the film, someone we've come to love and care about, someone we've come to feel protective about. And we see her revealed to be something else entirely. All we know of Peter is this blood-spattered ghoul whose face fills the screen before the credits roll. And then, of course, we have the sequels. Sleepaway Camp 2 and 3 really do bring in some very explicitly transphobic content. And so it really does tarnish the franchise as a whole. But I think that if you take the first film by itself, and if you really read against the grain, and if you look at what that relationship between the father and his partner is about, and if you look at the way Peter and Angela in the flashbacks interact, and if you look at what Aunt Martha represents, I think you can find some really interesting forms of power that are being exercised that are not typically discussed. I'm not saying it's a great portrayal of trans experience. It's not a portrayal of trans experience at all, but rather it becomes a metaphor for talking about alternative sexuality in the face of pressure to conform to gender and sexual binary norms. And I'm certainly not saying that trans people haven't felt harmed and haven't felt their identities called into question because of the portrayal in this film. I'm simply saying that if we suspend our disbelief and suspend our rush to objection for just a moment and read against the grain, we can find something really unique and interesting that even if we don't agree with it, we can grapple with it. We can roll it around and try to figure out what it might be telling us. And even if we don't come to the point where we agree with it, we can try to understand it. When all is said and done, I think there are a lot of really great reasons to go back to camp. All right, well, now that you've gotten to hear me obsess about one of my favorite movies of all time, now you get the opportunity to hear me fangirl at the actress who stars in that movie. In addition to playing the iconic role of Angela Baker in Sleepaway Camp and reprising that role for Return to Sleepaway Camp, my guest is a darling of the independent horror scene. She appears in Victor Crowley, the fourth installment of the Hatchet series, as well as in one current film and another upcoming film from the guest of my last podcast episode, Tommy Faircloth. She's got a number of projects that are coming out within the next year, and in addition to acting, she also does a fair amount of producing and traveling for conventions and fan events. I'm delighted to not only have her as an interview guest, but also as a friend. I hope you enjoy my interview with Felissa Rose. Well, let's start by talking about Sleepaway Camp, because that movie is crazy. It's one of the best twist endings in horror that there is. I mean, I think it's really one of the really great endings. And that was the first film that you ever did, is that right?
That's the first film I ever did, yeah. I was 13. It was actually my first audition.
Oh, wow.
I had a real manager in New York, and they sent me on the audition. And yeah, it was crazy because they said, we're looking for a flat-chested, wide-eyed 13-year-old. And I went. It was cool.
That is crazy. So when you got the role, did you see the whole script? I mean, did you know the whole story?
Yeah.
You did?
Yeah, there was as I said, I had a manager, and then the manager had an agent that got the call to them. And so I went to the agent's office in New York City, and I sat in their office. I remember just sitting there reading the entire script, and I had heard that some cast and crew had not seen the entire script, like they didn't know the real ending. I think Robert had taken the last page out, but I actually saw the whole thing, so I knew what was happening. And honestly, to me, I was only 13, but it read like a really fun script. Like, oh my gosh, kids go to camp, they do typical kid things, teenagers, fun, with some killings, sounds cool. And then that ending seemed really, something different, something out of the ordinary that we hadn't seen yet. So I thought this could be something special. And certainly it was different from anything that was out there.
So how did you approach the role? Because Angela doesn't actually speak a lot. As it goes on, she kind of opens up to a couple of the characters, but there's not a lot of acting. It's a lot of face acting and interacting with other characters without speaking. So that must have been an interesting challenge.
Yeah, it definitely was. I really didn't know what I was doing, to be perfectly honest. I mean, it was my first time that I had ever been in front of a camera and in front of a crew. And in that kind of medium. So it was sort of like I let Robert kind of navigate those waters for me. He was such a great director and so cool with the kids that he explained it to me exactly what he wanted scene by scene. He definitely wanted me to come off like I had been so severely bullied, so incredibly like hurt. I think that a lot of Angela's sort of in conveying what she needed to say with just her eyes, these kids were really kind of destroying her. And especially Judy and Meg, they were so mean. A lot of the film was so ahead of its time, even just with the bullying aspect. Here, we all know about bullying and kids being mean or whatnot. I don't think it was really like in the spotlight in the 80s, that kind of torture, the way we hear about everything now. He definitely wanted me to convey that kind of pain and help me along with that.
So I want to talk a little bit about the ending. For listeners who have not watched Sleepaway Camp, you need to get your fucking life together because it's been out for 30 years. So this is the only thing you're going to get that's close to a spoiler alert.
Really, people, get it together.
Get it together. You need to get your life. The movie starts with two kids, Peter and Angela, who are playing on a boat with their father. And there's an accident and we see the father floating face down in the water. And we see a child kind of from behind splashing, and then we see a bloody life preserver. And so we're meant to know that one of the kids has died. We flash forward a few years, and then we see Angela.
We definitely think someone has died.
Yeah, someone has died. And so we flash forward, and we see Angela and her cousin Ricky are going off to camp. And then, of course, there's murder and mayhem, as is tending to happen when you go off to camp in these 80s movies. And they really try to set up Ricky as the red herring. Whether that's successful or not, I think some parts are a little bit better at kind of setting him up. Basically, at the end, counselors are looking for Angela because she's missing, and they find her on the beach. And she stands up and she reveals that she is actually Peter, that Peter was the one of the two children that survived. Tell me a little bit about what it was like doing that scene. I've read some things about like a body double, and talk us through how that scene came together.
Yes, the end of the movie, we finally see Aunt Martha, and Aunt Martha is Ricky's mom, and she didn't want to have another boy. So she took the twin that lived, the boy, and dressed him as a girl. And so now that was going to be Peter turning into Angela, the other twin. So she sends them off to camp. And with the very end, they had to do the nude reveal with the penis. I'm completely naked. And they made a mask of my face and put it on a real boy. He was a college student because, it's nudity. So they had to get someone 18 or over. And he had to actually sort of be my build. Here I am, a 13-year-old girl, and I was all of like 90 pounds. And they had to wear the mask and whatnot. And they found someone, I have no idea who it was. To this day, I say he's the star of the film, but he hated every moment. He drank a bottle of Jack, got totally wasted, cried, and put that mask on. It was completely humiliating for him, I imagine, to wear this little girl mask and stand there. You're not an actor. But he was paid like $250 to stand there and do that. And that's, how they created that end scene. Originally, Ed French, the special effects artist, and Robert, the writer, director, producer, wanted to make a penis and put it on me. I'm still not sure to this day how they were going to do that because I am still a girl and I had little boobies. So, I did wear like a tight little kind of bra that flattened me out. What do you call it? That you put around your ankle,
Like an ace bandage?
Kind of like an ace bandage thing around me to keep me really flat. So they wanted it to look like a boy, and they got a real boy to wear that mask and that wig. And in the long shots, it's really him, and the close-up, it's me doing the actual, reveal face when they find out who it is.
And you're the one who's doing the noise, right? It's the weirdest ending because there's this reveal, and instead of any like explanation or any dialogue, you just see Angela, and she's in this like primal scream and making this growly, snarly kind of sound.
I just remember Robert pulling me to the side with the sound people, having me do some kind of, like you said, a primal kind of growl noise. I would imagine they kind of manipulated those noises. It is pretty gruesome and it's strange. It is me, but it probably has some other texture thrown in there to make it more exciting for the audience.
Yeah, I mean, that scene will like fuck you up. It certainly fucked me up for a long time, maybe still to this day.
That's what people say. You know, I do the conventions and I hear that it was pretty messed up. It's hard for me to be in it and kind of like grasp that.
Well, and I think for me, the reason why that was so affecting is because I didn't see it when it came out. I saw it when I was in high school. I just kind of rented it. We had gone to a Blockbuster or some shit like that. I'd always seen the VHS sleeve. And so I decided, well, I'll check this out. I'll see if it's any good. And I watched it. And of course, in high school, I was deeply closeted and still like figuring out my whole like sexual identity and all that kind of stuff. And then part of the frame story with the father is that he's got a male partner. Mm-hmm. And the scenes where they're together, they're actually like really tender, kind of sweet scenes. Like it's not what you would expect from the 80s. It's, you know, like the hideous gays are out to like kill your children. But they have this scene where the two men are in bed together, and not long after that is the big reveal. And so then I was like, I don't even know what I'm supposed to think about all of this. I don't know what all this is supposed to mean.
Yeah. I think especially for, we filmed in 1982, it was so interesting. So the father, I mean, he's in a relationship with his husband or boyfriend. Then when Angela is with a boy, she's thinking back and wondering, is that my identity? I think what we're saying with Sleepaway Camp, there's a lot of layers, you know, and there's so much to it. It's more than just, oh, she's going to camp, somebody's getting killed, holy shit, who's the killer? Oh my God, that's a weird ending. There's more to it. Who are these people and what's really happening? You know, I just think Angela as well, or Peter, was trying to figure out what is my identity? Who am I? You know, I'm not quite sure. And I always wish there was a prequel so we could sort of understand where the relationship with the father and his lover began, and Peter and Angela and Aunt Martha, where everything started. And then a real sequel so that we could understand what happened.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, and when I say real sequel, I mean like one that directly begins when they're at the camp with the reveal of, holy shit, Angela's a boy.
Something that follows up right on that. Because I do want to talk about the sequels, but before we get to that, I've got a couple more things about the first one. I think it's interesting. You talked about how Sleepaway Camp has a lot of layers. And one thing that really surprised me, when I was doing my master's thesis, I was focusing on portrayals and constructions of gender in film. And I had a chapter on horror films, and it really was inspired by Sleepaway Camp, because what I was fascinated by is, as I was reading all of these books about gender in horror films, people either just didn't talk about Sleepaway Camp at all, they just sort of ignored it, or they talked about it as if it was just one of those, it's just a Friday the 13th ripoff, it's just a kids go to camp and get murdered kind of flick, there's nothing important about it. And I thought, there's so much weird gender and sexuality stuff in here, I don't know why they would ignore that.
What we're talking about right now is really interesting, because I do feel like there's a divide between people either loving it and embracing all that it has. And then, you know, there are people either love it or hate it. And I get that because it's film, and that's typically how we view, you know, a lot of movies. But Sleepaway Camp is different because we're touching on all of the sexuality. Look at all of the boys at camp. Didn't you get the feeling that everybody was sort of very erotic with one another, and the only nudity we see is the skinny dipping with the boys, and they're all wearing like these jacked up shorts that they want to bang each other.
Yeah.
Right? Didn't you kind of feel like there was a lot more going on with the boys, like we wanted to see what was happening? They all were kind of entering the puberty, you know, part of their lives, and trying to understand each other.
And especially with the male campers, you see it a little bit with the female campers, but there was a real divide between the ones who were like just starting puberty and the ones who clearly were like towards the tail end. And they were sort of eroticized. I mean, Ronnie in those little red shorts.
And then you had Mozart with like Ricky and Paul, and they do that whole thing where he sits up and he's in his ass. Everything, when you break it down, there was like a homoerotic undertone.
Yeah, there's so much of that in there.
There's so much. It's funny because I wish, and I would love for you to speak with Robert Hiltzik, who wrote it, because so many times I've tried to break him and say, you do know that, like, we made a gay movie. It's amazing. I love it. It's so cool. And he's like, really? I didn't get that. I'm like, what? There's so much about the relationships with men in that film. And I wish we could embrace it. And especially with the ending of the movie. And my take on Angela is that there's two completely different sides to Angela. Angela, you know, what was happening in that house with Aunt Martha? Did she know she was changing genders? Did she want to transition? What's going on in her mind? But then the whole idea of the revenge story with her killing people had nothing to do with her sexuality. Because Angela was just being bullied by these horrible people. You know what I mean?
What I think is interesting, and that's how they kind of set it up, and that's how they kind of set up Ricky, is Ricky's very protective of Angela. And so everybody that gets murdered is somebody who has sort of picked on Angela. But at the same time, if you really kind of dig into what they do, everybody who gets murdered is somebody who forces Angela to confront the underlying truth of her body. So there's the camper who throws the water balloon and it hits her in the chest, which could potentially like reveal that she doesn't have breasts. And the cook who was going to molest her. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then Judy, who's like, you won't shower with the rest of us.
Yeah, and they throw her in the lake. And so again, it's that kind of like the clothing.
It's very part of that.
Yeah. And even the little kids. And that's one of the things that's different about Sleepaway Camp as well, is that usually really young children are sort of safe. It's always about adolescents and people in puberty, and she hatchets those kids.
Yeah, it was really. And we were all really young, which was different than a lot of the horror movies that were coming out at that time.
Yeah.
You know, it's like people were being cast if they were in their 20s. We had real teenagers. We were all like anywhere from 13 to like 15. And then the counselors, they were all 18.
There are a lot of people who think that Sleepaway Camp is transphobic. Right. What do you think about that?
That makes me sad. Only because I know in my heart that it's not. Because I mean, you know, I love that community. I feel very close. I feel very close to a lot of my friends who transitioned. I feel like a lot of people have reached out to me even during that time, oddly enough, when the movie first came out, like in the early 80s. And I was young, but I still understood, you know, I understood what that all meant. But I feel like the film has a very, very strong line between who Angela is and what Angela was doing. Who she was had nothing to do with why she was killing people. She had this crazy Aunt Martha, but her life, I feel like it was more about she lost her family. She went through a really difficult time. And then she was just treated really shitty by these people at camp. And I think that happens to a lot of people. So I feel like the audience for Sleepaway Camp, which is most of us, have been bullied in our life. I mean, who hasn't felt insecure, picked on, ridiculed by our peers? So that's really what the movie was about in terms of the revenge story. I think it's a great revenge story for any person that when you're picked on, it's like, yeah, well, fuck you. I think that's why people, you know, are drawn to it because, again, we've all felt that way. And it's like you kind of exercise all of those feelings through the movie. But I don't think it has anything to do with her sexuality. I think we should do a whole movie about Angela's sexuality.
Yeah, I love it. And I just want to know, and then we'll move on from Sleepaway Camp 1. What about Aunt Martha? She's one of the wackiest characters I have ever encountered.
I'm still trying to figure out what was going on. Because if you ask Jonathan Tiersten, the very first scene we ever filmed was the moment that we're in the home with Martha and Ricky and we're coming down the stairs and it says 8 years later. And he said he wanted to run for the hills. Like he couldn't believe what was happening. Like she was so over the top. But I think she was directed to be that way because, you know, that was just sort of her persona and why she made the choices she did. She was just kind of kooky like that. But she did a great job because Desiree really wasn't like that. I mean, I'm speaking about her, I think she's not here. She's a really wonderful woman. In fact, funny enough, in New York City tonight, she's at a screening with my good friend Brian Norton and my friend Joe Zazzo at the Rock Bar. And right now they're screening it and she's there. And I sent like a video message to them. So she's awesome and she totally loves the movie, you know? He did say to Robert while he's directing her, more, be over the top. And she's like, really? This isn't enough? And he said, no, do it bigger, crazier, like lift that hand, show that string. Like, okay.
So what do you think? I'm wondering, is Aunt Martha the villain of that film?
You're so amazing. I love you. I've never been asked that question. Is she the villain of the movie? If we ever point a finger at her, no, she's not the villain of the movie. I mean, Angela is the villain because she takes it upon herself to kill the people who are mean to her. She is the villain. I think, you know, Aunt Martha just tried to do the best she could. But Angela takes it into her own hands and says, no, I'm not going to take it any longer. I'm going to kill all of you.
That is so interesting. I love to hear
right?
I love to hear that.
Hard. What do you think?
And so because I've been grappling with this movie for like 30 years, I have finally come around to the idea of I think Aunt Martha is the villain. And I think...
But I don't think so because then we're saying that it's because of the sexuality. She didn't do anything. She just dressed her up that way. It's Angela who's doing the wrong deed. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I start to fall down my little queer theory rabbit hole because in the 80s, there's this whole idea of like gays raising children. And the sort of prevailing idea at the time was that if you had two gay men raising a child, the child would end up gay. And if two lesbians raised a child, the child would end up gay. And of course, now we know that that's all ridiculousness.
So bananas. I mean, could we... Seriously.
And so I think that what it might be is...
You know I hate all that, right?
I know, yeah. But I think that actually the message of the movie ends up being really sort of pro-gay in a way. So if you take the father and the partner and the fact that they have these very loving scenes together, I think that it sets it up that if Peter had been left alone, if he had been able to just continue as a boy and go through puberty, because I really think that he does have a connection with the male camper. Is his name Paul? Is that the other little boy?
The only person Peter spoke to was Paul.
Yeah.
And look at the relationship between Paul and who was calling Peter, but Angela Peter. How tender. That was a direct reflection of what Angela's father and lover had together. Very tender, very sweet. Angela didn't say goodnight or hello or what have you to any of the female counselors. It was with Paul.
And I think that if Aunt Martha hadn't intervened, that would have been like a love story. That would have been a little like go to camp, two little gay boys love story.
We need to make a movie about Paul and Peter.
This sort of alternative sleepaway camp.
I'm serious.
I love it.
I think this is how great movies come about. That is the best story I've ever heard from Sleepaway Camp.
So then I see Aunt Martha. She steps in and she's sort of representative of like heteronormativity. And so by forcing Peter to become Angela, she's the one who actually kicks off all of this sort of mayhem. And so I don't know. I'm still struggling with it. In 2 years, I'll have a completely different interpretation. After we talked about Aunt Martha, Felissa and I talked about the sequels, Sleepaway Camp 2 and 3. For more about that, make sure you check out Janessa After Dark, Sloppy Seconds number 3, which includes not only those outtakes, but outtakes from my interviews with Heidi Moore and Tommy Faircloth. Now we'll jump back into the conversation when Felissa tells us a little bit more about Return to Sleepaway Camp.
And then I came back for Return. Robert Hiltzik decided to do Return to Sleepaway Camp, and that was in 2003.
Yeah, and you had kind of a surprise reveal in that one as well. What convinced you to come back for that?
Reading the script and playing a man. That was so fun. You know, that was sort of the beginning for me of like playing something, you know, I like to play characters that are challenging and interesting, and it just read the first one. So I thought that was cool. I love the kill scenes. And just to go back to camp as an adult and work with Robert again just was incredible.
Now, switching gears a little bit, I met you at Days of the Dead in Indianapolis a couple of years ago, and you do a ton of conventions and stuff. What are some of your favorites? Like, do you like doing conventions? Are there specific ones that you really like?
I'm getting on a plane first thing in the morning. I love conventions. You know, there are so many reasons. I mean, obviously, I love people. I love talking to people. I'm in love with the genre. I'm just madly in love. Aside from my kids and my husband and my friends, the genre is just an incredibly huge part of my world. So getting to meet people who work on all different films that I adore makes me incredibly happy. Travel. I love traveling and connecting, and all of that is just like appealing to me. So I probably do at least 2 to 3 conventions a month. It's just exciting. I mean, I'm very grateful for it because it's all because of Sleepaway Camp. I can't even explain how thankful I feel to be able to go and travel and meet people who are, you know, like family.
What's your favorite convention story or memory? Craziest thing that happened?
Oh my goodness, I have so many. Meeting you is one.
Well, of course, meeting a big drag queen.
Because I was in love with you from Hello. Not to quote like Jerry Maguire, but you had me at Hello. And remember Jenny? The two of us were fighting over you.
I do, you and Jenny fighting over me.
Like mesmerized, in love with you. Legit, like, oh my God, do not take this person away from me. I just want to like crawl up all over you. So that's, you know, that's something. It's always about relationships for me, you know. I love people. I love everyone's story. I don't know. I'm a big old hippie. Like, let's all lay down and hug each other and get to know one another. I like conventions because they feel like that. They're just people who don't judge and want to take care of one another. So the stories for me are just kind of the same. Like, I want to hug you and love you and take care of you. You know, that's always what it's about for me.
Any favorite actors or other celebrities that you've met at a convention?
Oh my God. Well, I love Kane Hodder.
He's so nice. He's wonderful.
He's one of those people who, you know, you love him in so many movies and Friday the 13th and Victor Crowley and whatnot. And then you go to his table and he's loving and cool. And then you get to know who he really is. And he's just a big old softy who will take care of everybody. And I just love him. So I adore him. I mean, I love everybody. I love Dee Wallace. I love Sid Haig. Oh my gosh, I can't get enough of him. You know, I was like always the outsider. For a long time, I wasn't really around. And then suddenly I was called in like, oh, come. It's been a few years now, and I'm really enjoying it. I've gotten to meet all of my heroes and, you know, Tony Todd and, gosh, Adrienne Barbeau. It's just one after the other. You just kind of like look around, and it's really cool. A couple of weeks ago, I met Costas Mandalore, and I'm a huge Star fan, so I freaked out. And it's like Jeffrey Combs is there and Barbara Crampton. You can't even get over, like, the personalities, and everybody's loving.
And a lot of people do know you from Sleepaway Camp, but what's your favorite role that you've ever played?
It's hard for me to say that because it's like having babies, you know. You can't just say, I love this child. You know, you love them all. And you love them for various reasons. I love every part I've ever played. I'm thankful for and I've loved. Definitely Victor Crowley. You know, there are different reasons. I'm proud. I love Adam Green. I love the Hatchet series. I'm still pinching myself that I'm part of it. So I love that. And I loved playing that character because she was so over the top. I love a movie I did called Zombie Killers, Elephant's Graveyard, with Billy Zane and Misha Barton and Gabrielle Stone and Dee Wallace, because my character is the antithesis of me. I'm the preacher of the town. And I don't look like myself and I don't act like myself. I mean, she's like Marcia Gay Harden from The Mist. That's who a lot of people have compared it to. She's the preacher, and that was fun to just walk into her shoes. So, and then Garlic and Gunpowder, I got to play a crazy person, and it's a lot of fun parts. I'm really proud of a lot of the films I've done. As of recently, I did Killer Rose with Caroline Williams, and I love that movie. That's coming out in 2019, and I'm super excited. It's like Kill Bill. It's a very like Tarantino and Rodriguez movie. Fun, shoot 'em up, girls all over the place. I love them all.
I don't know what you're saying about you can't pick a favorite child, because obviously, I mean, like, my mother would probably never admit it, but I'm clearly the favorite child. I mean, how could you have...
I'm sure you are. Yes.
How could you have this child and not have it be the favorite?
What's that?
I said, how could you have me as a child and not make me the favorite?
You're so delicious and amazing. You're my favorite child, and I'm even for you.
Yeah.
No, that goes without saying. Yes, that is true. Uh-huh.
And you mentioned...
Absolutely.
You mentioned Garlic and Gunpowder. So have you done a lot of comedies too?
No. That's my first out of the genre movie, is Garlic and Gunpowder. And Kathleen from Victor Crowley, people will say, you know, she's more of the comedy. Because, you know, Adam Green was Hatchet. He does a lot of... kind of like Sleepaway Camp 2 or 3, like there's comedy with the gore.
Yeah. Do you like comedy acting? Would you like to do more of that?
I love comedy. I think it's sensational in terms of, you know, just the timing, the humor, the everything is wonderful. But I think my heart is so deeply rooted in horror because that's where I started. And that's what I love. I just kind of stepped out of it and did Garlic and did a couple of others, I think. Aside from Kathleen, I think I have a couple of other comedic roles, but I want to stay with horror, you know, unless like there's some crazy, amazing sitcom that maybe even includes horror. I think the two are fun. They're like peanut butter and chocolate.
Yeah, definitely. Going back to horror, you are in Death House, which has some like huge names. Like that's such a big, for people who are fans of the genre and they can pick out these different people. There's so many great people in that movie. Tell me a little bit more about Death House. Death
House was a movie that started a few years ago with Gunnar Hansen. May he rest in peace. He wrote a script. And my business partner, Harrison Smith, teamed up with Entertainment Factory. They were friends with Gunnar. And then they all sort of came together, and Harrison rewrote the script. It was funny because he was staying at my house, and he's like, hey, I think we're going to do this movie, Death House, and there's all these people in it. I'm like, okay, cool. And then the next thing I know, he's like, come aboard, come help produce, act in it, and this is the cast. And it was like, Kane Hodder, Sid Haig, Bill Moseley, Barbara Crampton, Dee Wallace, Vernon Wells, Sean Wells, Danny Trejo, Camille Keaton. I'm like, wait, what? It became like just a labor of love. And it's a movie that's totally out of the box, very original, very dark, and it's a super cool story. It's like Jurassic Park meets, I don't know, some kind of something crazy, because it's just a story that we haven't heard before. And the acting is sensational. It's really Kane's movie. He's the star. It has so many elements that are so unique just to this movie. It's different than anything you've seen before. So it's very cool. And it comes out December 11th.
I'm excited to see it because I know that was one of the ones, they were kind of talking about it and building up some of the buzz at the first Days of the Dead that I went to.
I know. And it's been a long haul. Like, the first distributor had some problems with it, and it just had to change hands. I think anything we're, excited to hear about, sometimes it's worth the wait. I think everybody's going to love it. It's gotten great buzz, and it's a cool movie. I'm excited for it to finally be out.
Now, my last episode of Janessa After Dark featured a very adorable man that you might know called Tommy Faircloth. And I know that you just finished shooting on his latest feature, A Nun's Curse. You're kind of the villain in that, which is exciting. So what should we expect from you in that film?
I'm all sorts of sweet. No, not at all. Tommy is one of my favorite people on the planet. We are super close. We met several years ago, funny enough, at a Days of the Dead in Atlanta. And he came over to my table. I was with Jonathan Kirsten. And he's like, want to do some fireball shots? And I'm like, oh, baby, you are singing my song. So we started doing some shots, and then he showed me his trailer to Babyface. Dollface. What was his first name?
Dollface, yeah.
Yeah, Dollface. Babyface. That's Silver and Red. Another amazing friend, Dave Parker. But we went over and we started looking at it, and I'm like, oh my God, that's so cool. And then he said, well, do you want to maybe work together? And I said, of course, which is cool. You're like hoping that somebody you love and you connect with, it somehow happens. And then he called me very soon after and said, I have this script. It's called Family Session with Mark Patton. And I'm like, okay, I'm in. Where do I sign up? and we made a really cool movie. He made a cool movie, and I was happy to be part of it. And then he wrote A Nun's Curse, and it was like completely off the charts, like badass, amazing film. And we just filmed it with Damien Maffei, who I just love. He's from Strangers 2. Did you see him when we FaceTimed?
I did. Yes, I saw him. He's cute.
So awesome. He's sweet. He's funny. He's talented. He's just everything. He's just a whole big ball of awesome. And the movie takes place in the scariest prison ever in South Carolina. So all I can say is good luck to the audience, because I'm terrified and I'm in it. So it's cool. It's going to be a great film. Another one by Tommy Faircloth. There's definitely people out there who have, you have to notice him because he's just so freaking talented. It's crazy. And I have to mention my friend Marcel Walsh, who's another one who's so super talented, and I've been working with him. We just did Rootwood. And Rootwood is super cool if you check out the trailer. Some of these directors are just, out of control, amazing.
I'll have to check that out. I loved Family Possessions. That's such a good movie.
And recently seeing Nun's Curse, you're going to be like, what?
What I loved about Family Possessions was, it's a slasher film and it's also a paranormal film. And it actually works to mash those two together. It's not like they're just like, oh, we want this kind of ghost witch entity, but we also want a slasher and just throw it all together. It actually works together.
Yeah, definitely. And the way he develops the characters and his atmosphere and just the colors of the film. He's one of the most talented directors I've definitely worked with. Top 3.
He's pretty cool. I like him and Rob.
Oh my God. I'm so in love with both of them. It's disgusting. I can't even handle it. They're coming to Spooky Empire next weekend.
Oh, that's exciting.
I need to be with them all the time. I wish you were going. It's killing me. You need to be there.
I know. That would be fun.
Think about it.
Yeah, I'll sneak away.
Come on.
Now, in Family Possessions, you're a little bit of a bitch. Your character is not particularly likable. Yeah.
I know. Alcoholic, mean, rude, bitch mom.
Yeah. Do you like playing that kind of character? What are the kind of challenges as an actor to playing that sort of character?
I love it. For me, it's playing someone who's just completely rude and awful. It's so fun because you get to just be somebody that you do things that you can't in life. And it's like anything. We're all kids, so it's just playing. And Tommy brings out the crazy in me. The set is like a playground. And we have such a good time. It's awesome.
I love it when you're yelling up the stairs at your daughter about the stripper that her dad has run off with.
I can Google it! Oh.
She's got a blue waffle. Google it!
And that was all Tommy. He's like, have you ever heard of a blue waffle? I'm like, no. He's like, well, Google it. And I did, and I was going to throw up. And then he said, okay, now be the character and do it. I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Directors like that are awesome.
Yeah, for the listeners, if you don't know what a blue waffle is, Google it at your own risk. You will be horrified.
Horrified. I was shocked.
Oh my gosh. You are also married to a gorgeous musician, Darren Miller, who's a musician, and you have 3 fantastic kids who love to ham it up on your Instagram.
They do. And they're all in different horror movies.
They are so funny. Are they interested in show business, like potentially as a career?
It's so funny because people ask, people ask me, I don't think so, but they're having a great time playing in my world. So when I'm doing something like Tales of Halloween or, the Slayer videos or Hanukkah, they'll come on board and, yeah, Mom. And my daughter is actually taking drama in junior high, and she gets the lead all the time. She's the best actress. But it's not like anything that we've done, I don't want to say professionally because they are working in great movies. I don't know. They're just not thinking about it as a career. They're kind of just enjoying where it is right now. Oh, it's Mom's life. Okay, this is cool. I think I probably have 1 or 2 actors on my hands, and maybe my son will be like special effects or a director. But right now, we're just kind of enjoying hanging out all together. It's not like this is my career the way I was when I was 13.
Since you started so young, Is there any specific advice you would give to your kids just based on your own experiences?
Making movies is really an adult world, and it's very hard for a child to kind of enter that. I even saw it with my son, you know, working long hours and working primarily with adults. It's hard, and it takes a very special kind of child to like kind of immerse themselves into that. So I would just say, if it's really your passion, really your dream, go for it, and just kind of enjoy it, and don't think too much about it. Just have fun, just play, and see where it takes you. That's kind of my advice.
Not take it so serious, because nobody wants to raise the next Danny Bonaducci.
Oh my God. Or the next Lindsay Lohan.
Yeah.
You know, right? It's hard. I think for me, the only reason why I've kind of had, you know, something of a career here is because I didn't, thank God, I didn't get any jobs when I was anywhere from like 14 to 18. Because you get burned out. You're completely burnt out. How long can you work in any industry from when you're like a little kid? So of course it makes sense that you'd be ready to like jump off a ledge or take some drugs. It's hard.
And what advice would you give? One thing that is really big right now is people talking about sexual harassment, and the Me Too movement is really kind of having its moment, hopefully changing things for women in entertainment. What advice would you give to young women who want to get into acting, and especially into acting in horror films?
I mean, just be really confident in yourself. Listen to your gut. I mean, that's the most important thing. Don't go against yourself or go against your grain or what you think is, you know, better judgment. Make good choices. Just be true to yourself and be strong in that. It's a great career. It's a great business, but make sure you put yourself with good people you trust. Just be a very cautious individual in that you know what you're doing. Whether you're, you know, a teenager or an adult, you have to really be aware of what's typical in that every career could have somebody crazy. Listen to your heart and your gut, and you'll know where to be directed.
Oh, I like that.
Right? I mean, don't you think you could be a dentist and meet up with crazy people? Just be really strong in who you are.
Absolutely.
Any career could lead you astray. You have to really just be true to yourself. We all have to. I mean, I think the ultimate goal in life is to just be who you are, have great people around you, listen to your gut, and be okay with saying no. I tell my girls every single day, there's so much power in the word no. Whether it's, you know, another person or school, what have you, just be strong in that you know who you're talking to and what you're talking about. Whether it's yes or no, but no especially whether it's, you know, another person who's trying to convince you to do something that you don't want to do.
Is there any sort of dream role that you would love to play, whether it's a role that already exists that you would love to take on, or even something that you'd like to create as sort of a specific kind of story you'd like to tell? Is there any kind of dream role that's knocking around in your head?
I would love, that's a great question. Anything that I haven't, you know, portrayed, which is a lot. I would love to do something that sparks my heart. And I think that has to do with, you know, any kind of character that's interesting and fun and ambitious. You know, so often we're giving roles that are like just vanity, but something that I can really put my heart, soul, and body into, and my mind. I think I love vampires. I'd love to do a great vampire film. Still, I'm on the charts to do something with Adrienne Barbeau called Love Bites. I'd love to get that going. So anything in that genre would be super cool for me.
I think that's all the questions that I had for you.
I love you so much. Thank you.
Well, and thank you so much for doing my interview. I was very excited when Tommy said, yes, Felissa will do it.
Oh my God, I love you deeply. You know that. I would do anything for you.
Oh, that's sweet. I really like you, and I'm always nervous about asking people that I've met. I don't want it to come off weird. Like, I don't want it to come off like, oh, well, I became friends with you so I could interview you for my podcast that 6 people
You're
will listen to.
brilliant and amazing. Anybody's lucky to stop you. Amazing person. You, I'm going to just jump all over you. I wish you were coming to Florida.
I know, that would be so fun.
You're killing me.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Felissa Rose, screen icon and scream queen from Sleepaway Camp. We mentioned it briefly in the interview, but I really love the story of how the two of us met. Picture it, June 2016. I was supposed to go to Dark Shadows Festival, and because of a whole long story that I won't get into here, my plans had to change and I started Googling other events. The only thing I could find for that weekend, because that was the one that I had off of work, was Days of the Dead Indianapolis. Now at the time, there were a couple of guests that I was interested in seeing. Kristy Swanson from Buffy the Vampire Slayer was going to be there. Ginger Lynn from the Vice Academy movies. A couple of others. But I thought, what the hell, I'm gonna go. And so I changed my tickets and I bought VIP passes and I started putting together my outfits. And once I had committed to going to that show, they started announcing a really fantastic guest after guest. They added Shawnee Smith from the Saw movies, John Hader from Napoleon Dynamite. He doesn't have much to do with horror movies, but he was fun. Linnea Quigley was added, Derek Mears from the 2009 Friday the 13th, and a whole bunch of other people that I was really kind of interested to see. Well, 2 weeks before I was set to go, I went to the website one more time and they had added Felissa Rose from my all-time favorite horror movie, Sleepaway Camp. I was so excited. I knew that I had to get there. And I knew that I had to find her right away and meet her and just ask her about the movie. I've had such a fascination with that movie for so many years. So I get to Indianapolis. It's the first day of the convention. I'm a little bit nervous, but I'm looking real cute. I had a skull print dress from Pinup Girl, my Marilyn Monroe hair, and a little black and white striped fascinator. And I was ready to go. And I hit the convention floor a little bit early. I had VIP tickets, which means you can access the convention floor a half hour early. And a lot of the booths were still being set up. And I looked around and I didn't see Felissa's table. I didn't see any sign saying where she was going to be. I made a couple loops through the two rooms that had the celebrities in them. And when I didn't see her, I saw that Ginger Lynn was set up in one of the rooms. And so I got in her line. A lot of horror fans know her from the Rob Zombie movie, but I absolutely love her from the Vice Academy movies. I used to watch the USA Up All Nights with Rhonda Shear on Friday and Gilbert Gottfried on Saturdays, and they would always play the Vice Academy movies, and the first two have both Linnea Quigley and Ginger Lynn Allen. And of course, Ginger Lynn stuck around for number 3. So I got in her line and I thought, this will be great. I'll get a chance to meet her, talk to her a little bit, wait for more people to set up, and then I'll go look for Felissa again. And because there weren't that many people set up, there was a little bit of a line, and so I got in Ginger Lynn's line, and I'm just kind of waiting my turn. And I'm kind of looking around and I look to the right, and at the table, literally right next to Ginger Lynn's table, is Felissa Rose. That's her table. I don't know how I could have missed her. I must have walked past it 10 times. But there she is, and she's signing something for someone. And it just so happens that right as I see her, she looks up, we lock eyes, and she points at me and she says, "You! I can already tell you're going to be my favorite person this weekend." And she just goes back to signing the autograph. And I was like, am I high? Did that just happen? It was literally like some sort of scene out of a really poorly written movie. It's the kind of thing that you would never ever imagine would happen in real life. And it just happened with me and Felissa Rose, my absolute all-time scream queen idol. I died a little bit inside. And I stay in Ginger Lynn's line, and she's got a couple people in her line. And so I go up and I talk to Ginger Lynn, and she's wonderful. She's really sweet, and we talked about the Vice Academy movies a little bit, and she gave me a guitar pick that I passed on to my friend Angie's boyfriend Jason. He's a guitar player, and right around the time that I was finishing up, she had gotten through her line, and so she comes out from behind the table and she's like, "Who are you? You look fabulous. I have to know you." And I was like, "I came here to see you." And I sounded like a crazy person. I'm sure she thought I was some insane sort of fangirl, but I was like, "I came here to see you." And I told her that I've been obsessed with Sleepaway Camp for a long time, and I just told her a little bit about being a big old drag queen in North Dakota, and she told me all about Sleepaway Camp and what she felt about Angela and Aunt Martha and all the different kind of people at camp, some of which you got to hear in the interview. And it was just a really wonderful experience. And it's just so fun. And it's such a blessing that she has become a friend. I really appreciate her sitting down and doing this interview. All of my episodes of Janessa After Dark are like my babies. And you know you shouldn't choose your favorite baby. We talked about that. But just like Mama Champagne would obviously say that I'm the favorite, I think this episode might be my favorite. I hope you enjoyed the stories. We've got more shenanigans from Felissa's interview coming in Sloppy Seconds number 3. That'll also feature outtakes from Tommy Faircloth and Heidi Moore. So be on the lookout for that coming very soon. Also, don't forget that I have my limited series podcast, Miss Jaye, The Renovation, is coming very soon, starting in November, and we'll be releasing episodes. I'm going to try to stick to a regular schedule, but we know how that goes. My goal is to release at least 2 a month, maybe more if I can get to it. Just keep going until we work through all of those books and hopefully work through all of my issues. All right, thanks for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode. Bye. This episode of Janessa After Dark includes royalty-free music from bensound.com. Included in this episode are the tracks Actionable, which serves as our podcast intro, the song Badass, which played under the bumpers for Felissa Rose's interview, and Sexy, the track you're listening to now. For these and more great royalty-free tracks, please visit bensound, that's BEN sound.com. Janessa After Dark is written and directed by Chris M. Stoner and is a Champagne Dreams production.